Chris, thank you for joining us on Capital and Power. And I want to start with the end of the book, and I'll probably mispronounce the Treasury Secretary's name, Albert Gallatin, but you chose a quote at the end of the book. I want you to explain to us when Gallatin said, quote, "All our dreams can come true if we have the courage to pursue them." How do you interpret that?
Albert Gallatin was one of the greatest ever Americans. He had a remarkable career in addition to being Treasury Secretary. He, I think, rightly has a statue in front of the building. And what he was reflecting, I think, was just the fact that the age when he served in government was a very optimistic time. It was a time of growth, a lot of challenges too. So he was basically saying, if we have the courage to move forward and do the things that we want to do, then we can be successful. Wind the clock forward to today, what would he say? Probably something different.
Well, the reason I started with that, because we're going to talk about inflation, we're going to talk about government spending and debt. And as a journalist, because I'm no longer a journalist, I create content, but I'm in the private market now. I left media a while ago. But as a journalist and at Fox and at Yahoo, I was constantly writing about the threat of U.S. debt, what that would mean. And one of the things that always stuck out to me was, but it never happens. The calamity that many people who I respect and trust would discuss never appears to happen. And you address this towards the end of the book, and I'll be pulling some quotes. But as we stand at this moment in time, we've just passed the, quote, big, beautiful bill. I know people who say it's not so beautiful. What are your thoughts?
Americans are aspirational people. We don't like paying for things. So, going back to the beginning of the Republic, it was always difficult to get Americans to pony up to pay for things like the Revolutionary War, for example. They couldn't raise taxes to free us from British rule. So since World War II, when the U.S. was the victor in this conflict, we became even more empowered, more aspirational as a people, and we felt entitled. You remember that phrase, the greatest ever generation, the people who fought World War II, and they felt entitled to come home and have a party, and they did. But the trouble is that we never get around to actually paying for it via taxes. The U.S. franchise, the dollar, everything else after World War II allowed us to just borrow the money. So until someone tells you that you can't do that anymore, that is the model. And that's why, when people say to me, Chris, do you expect a big calamitous change? The answer is no, because the U.S. has become a utility for the rest of the world. They use our money. It costs them nothing. They can finance in dollars. They can do a variety of things. And then off they go. So U.S. is kind of captured in a way. We are captive to our own success. And I think until we get to the point where maybe we revisit that great line from Ronald Reagan when he asked Congress to give him the line item veto, I think at some point in the near future, we're going to have to replace Congress as the entity that decides what to spend. We may, in fact, have to put not just a line item veto in the hands of the executive branch, but force them to prioritize savings. How do you do that? You put all of the or spending rather, you put all the spending on a piece of paper. When you get to the point where you don't have any money left, you draw a line across the page and you don't do what's below the line. Americans are not used to that kind of discipline.
No, we are not used to that discipline. My dad, was trained as an economist but became a lawyer, he used to always talk about the United States needs to have a parliamentary system. I don't want to get into that argument. But what I just heard you say, in our lifetime, do you see that perhaps happening, that somebody actually has, despite the consequences of that, because there would be pain, that ability to control U.S. government spending? And what would the consequences of that be?
Yes. Yeah, I think it's inevitable. When people say to me, Chris, how would you fix this problem? It's very simple. I would freeze spending, and I would have Congress legislatively give the executive branch the ability to reprogram funds, move things around, and then go back to Congress and say, we really can't do this, or we should be doing that, and have a more rigorous budgetary and control function. Because what we're talking about here is an inability of our country to govern itself. This is basic governance. I'll give you an example. I have a good friend who's on the board of a not-for-profit, and they were going to take out a loan to do some very interesting and important things. Nobody had ever said to them, how are you going to pay back the loan? Okay. This is the conversation we need to have as a country, which is that we can only do certain things, the military, all sorts of entitlement spending, other stuff. We see that in the big, beautiful bill that President Trump has just passed through the Congress. There's all sorts of things in there that we don't have to do, but politically, because America's politics is based on commerce, if you will, bringing back the bacon, that's what we end up with. We end up with a very suboptimal result.
Before I give you the first quote from the book, I just have to ask you, could we get out of this mess that we're in by simply freezing all spending at current levels, or do we have to actually cut? Would it be a freeze and then cut everything 10%? What's the easiest way to get out of this?
Well, the easy way, since Congress can't pass a budget, this is why I say we have to replace them as a budgetary organism in our government. They raise spending 10% a year. That's what continuing resolutions are. So if we just stop doing that and say, no, we're going to freeze spending for 4 years, the economy will grow while we're doing this. Maybe we raise a little taxes here and there, do this, do that. But I think we have to rationalize our priorities in a way that we haven't had to do in 100 years. I mean, think about it this way. Carter Glass was the great Treasury Secretary who ultimately sponsored the Federal Reserve System in Congress. He was a giant. Can you find anybody in Congress today who's even remotely like Carter Glass? No. We have a bunch of midgets, and all they care about is getting reelected. That's it. They don't think about the country. They don't think about finance or governance. Not at all. So, until we mature, I think, a little bit and are forced to put more serious people into public life, which is what happened in the 1930s, remember, then I think we're just going to toddle along in a kind of ridiculous fashion.
So let me quote from the book. And this is one of the longer quotes, but I'm going to read back to you your creation. Quote, over the decades, the political will to collect taxes in the United States has failed, often because conservative politicians think wrongly that depriving the Treasury of revenue will somehow slow federal spending. If Democrats tend to be too enamored of demand-side policies and debt, Republicans tend to have a 19th century view of money and markets that is entirely antiquated. Yes. My best Ricky Ricardo impersonation, explain that to us.
Well, people like my friend Grover Norquist, Americans for Tax Reform, he has spearheaded an effort for 20 plus years that says, you have to sign my pledge, no new taxes. We're going to starve the progressive New Deal government of money. But that's not what happens. What happens is Congress spends money, they borrow a good bit of it in the capital markets, and so we continue. The conservatives think that they can change public policy simply by trying to limit the availability of cash to the government. That's why we have a battle over the debt ceiling periodically. What did Donald Trump do? He increased the debt ceiling by $5 trillion. So we don't have to talk about it until the next election or after the next election. This is all politics. So what I'm trying to say to you is that we don't have a rational discussion about spending one way or another in this country. It just depends on who happens to have a majority in the House and the Senate, and then they get their little pet projects passed into law, and then tomorrow is another day, right?
Is one of the things I loved my experience at Fox Business Network and at Fox News because I got to travel the country, parts of the world. But I was at the groundbreaking for the Train to Nowhere in California, the now $20 billion, and it's cost overrun beyond belief. And I saw a headline recently that Gavin Newsom is going to sue the federal government because they've cut funding for this thing. That's never been built. It's a disaster. I was there at the groundbreaking it has to be almost 13 years ago. I can't even remember the year, but it's around 2009 or 10. They're going to sue over the $4 billion that was cut from it. That seems to be the politics. We're building a train to nowhere in California that's going to do nothing.
That's right. Well, the time to build trains was the 1900s.
Right.
Today, getting the property and all the other things that go along with a new train line is probably prohibitively expensive.
So let me ask you this. I'm going to be a little bit self-centered because I live in New York City, one of the most
Mm.
expensive places on the planet. I'm fortunate enough to be able to live here. We have a good life. I'm not complaining. But I'm worried about the future. You know that we're about to elect. He calls himself a socialist. I would call him a communist. I've read the Democratic Socialist platform. It is nationalized private property, nationalized business. I have genuine fears as I've become older and probably more conservative. I'm the crazy uncle at Thanksgiving that everyone laughs at. But this worries me because in the United States, money can leave. And in New York City, money can leave. And so I'm
Mm.
curious how you're viewing what's about to happen in what I consider one of the greatest cities on the planet.
Well, look, New York is the greatest progressive city in the world at a time when we were able to do and, really finance anything. This goes back to Robert Moses and Al Smith. All of the accoutrements, all of the public facilities and assets that were created at that time were relatively inexpensive to create, but they become more expensive over time. So, for example, there are more than 500,000 publicly owned housing units in New York City. The average rent doesn't even cover half of the cost of providing those units. So ultimately, what you see in New York is that people can't afford to live here anymore. They want to live here. There are a lot of services and benefits to living in New York. But if you don't have a couple $100,000 a year in taxable income, I don't see how you do it. I personally think we should be resettling people out of New York City into some of the other communities around the metro area because it's cheaper. You have transportation, you have schools, you have everything else. But no, everybody wants to be in the five boroughs. I lived in New York City for many years, and we moved up to Sleepy Hollow for precisely the reason you just articulated. So what I'm trying to say is inflation drives all of this. And when you provide services, entitlements, everything else, and you fund it with debt on top of a fiat currency, so you put debt on top of debt, okay? Ultimately, people pay through inflation. Initially, when Triffin came out with his famous thesis about the reserve status of the dollar and what was going to happen and everything else, he initially thought, well, we have to run big external deficits. But now what we understand is that it's not just big external deficits for the U.S., it's internal inflation. And the politics of this are profoundly toxic.
I'm going to come back to New York City because it is, I gave up a life many years ago to move here without a job and it worked out well. But this is a quote from the book. The cost to Americans for the special role of the dollar is not just the abstraction known as, quote, trade deficits, but also high domestic inflation. I'm going to come back to that part of this, but this seems to be especially the case when the government runs big fiscal deficits, which transfer public resources to debt holders. Here's where, and I explain to me. I've always thought that the dollar being the reserve currency worldwide was a benefit to us as Americans, keeping goods cheaper. And the analogy that was explained to me was the t-shirt that my dad bought many years ago is actually cheaper today because of the dollar being the reserve currency. What am I getting wrong? Because I don't think that's what you're saying in that quote.
No, and that T-shirt was probably made in China or some other
Today it's
nation.
made in China. It used to be made in Mississippi.
That's correct. And in those days, you could produce garments in Mississippi, and they were competitive. Indeed, they were globally competitive. That's changed, though. So as the U.S. has seen the apparent affluence and the apparent increases in living standards, wages, etc., we always looked at these things in nominal terms, Adam. But when you look at them in real terms, what you realize is that we were pricing ourselves out of business. My old friend Fritz Hollings, a senator from South Carolina, used to say, "Can I live on 2 bowls of rice a day?" And what he was saying is that there are countries around the world that are willing to compete with us on those terms, specifically China, which is a modern version of Great Britain. It's a totalitarian mercantilist state that uses surveillance and coercion to basically, keep itself in power. And their economic model is purely export driven. So by definition, someone has to run a deficit. In other words, in order for China to be successful. So in that kind of model, of course, we're not going to make T-shirts in Mississippi. We can't. Not even close. There used to be garment industries all around New York City, Newark, New Jersey. All of these places were extremely competitive. Philadelphia. Philadelphia used to be the manufacturing center of the world after World War II. What is it today? It's an empty city. So the reserve role of the dollar, unfortunately, tends to make the U.S. less and less competitive in many industries that we use to build the wealth we see around us.
So I need a basic economics lesson here. I will admit I slept through a lot of my economics classes in college. If we transition away from being the reserve currency, how long does it take? And what does that mean for us in the United States? Do things become more expensive? Is it a net positive for us in the United States?
I think it is a net positive politically. The transition's underway. What we are seeing in this country, and I think globally, is a return of gold as the core reserve asset for all countries. It's going to take time. It will happen gradually. And it's not that people will stop using the dollar. It's just that it's going to become smaller and smaller relative to other currencies. When you see China and Russia buying gold hand over fist, even though they still have very small currencies, and they're not looking to take on the role of the dollar anytime soon, what are they doing? They're building defensive structures that will help them navigate and operate their country, their economy, their exports in a world where the dollar is no longer the central focus of trade, finance, and other activities globally.
I love throwing quotes at people when I get to read their books. And I didn't read the whole book. I read portions of it. But you wrote, in a historical sense, creating a means for the United States to transition away from bearing the full burden of serving as the reserve currency for the world economy would truly mark the end of the Cold War period and, more broadly, the recovery of the world from the two world wars. You then go on to talk about how long all that takes. So when we talk about this transition that we are experiencing now, one of the parts of the book is about the tricentennial in 2076. I would love to be around as long as I'm healthy. I doubt I will be. But this transition, will I, as a person in their 50s, will I see it? Will I feel it? Or is it going to be, the world's children and grandchildren?
I think all of us are going to feel it in a very gradual sense. It'll be imperceptible. The first hint that we've really gotten past a tipping point, Adam, is when the dollar starts to weaken. We're already down near the lows that we reached during the first Trump administration, and I think it's likely that the dollar is going to go lower. I've told my readers that I want to see them with at least 10% of their portfolios in gold. And the reason is that I think that trade-off between dollars and gold is going to accelerate over time. As the federal deficit gets bigger, as we approach a time when we probably have to have a debt restructuring in the U.S., all of these things are going to make people more and more hesitant to keep their wealth in dollars. They may use dollars for commerce. They may use dollars to buy and sell things and pay wages and all of that. But if you really are worried about preserving value, you're going to have to diversify out of dollars.
I just made a very bad decision earlier this week regarding dollars. Let me ask you this. A previous guest, I think it was Rick Rule, on Capital and Power, actually talked about the fact that in most portfolios, gold is less than 1% the make of that portfolio. To go to 10% would seem drastic to me. I mean, I was looking at gold funds, and they're, should I? Should the people listening? I think you'd say yes.
Well, yes, but let me explain. The dollar, going back to the Civil War, has always had a bit of an arbitrage with gold. So there were times when paper would gain a lot of value. There were times when paper would lose value. During the Civil War, paper dollars traded down to about 20 cents on the dollar versus gold. because nobody wanted paper. You have to understand that there's always alternatives. And the fact that the dollar was stable for so long put everybody to sleep, Adam. It made all of the fund managers out there think that you could just play in stocks and bonds denominated in dollars. Other markets were very small. Now, I did an interview about 2 months ago with a friend of mine named Henry Smith, who's a longtime manager of a gold fund. He's based in the Bahamas now. In fact, Henry is building a repository in the Bahamas for physical gold. Think about that. And the story he told was exactly what you said. In 2015, when he started his most recent funds, he had worked in Zurich. He had worked for all the big Swiss banks. And he said to them, gold, it's at the bottom of a long-term trend. You should be putting this into your portfolios. And they looked at him like he was crazy. Well, he's not crazy now, is he? He has consistently built value by including gold in portfolios, not 100%, 10, 15%, but the return on gold has been dramatic. See, everyone's focused on crypto assets, which I view as a symptom of what's going on inside the U.S. right now. And I tell people, no, it's not about crypto, it's about gold.
I'm glad you brought up crypto, and we have a lot more to talk about. We have to get to taxes, but let me talk about crypto. I am a Luddite when it comes to crypto. I am Gen X. My brother has done very well with Bitcoin, and I hope he remembers me fondly should he leave this world. And the Bitcoin it's good, but it scares me partially out of my ignorance. But it's tied to dollars. The whole premise to me of cryptocurrencies, this quote pulling away from fiat currency, is a load of bonk because it's tied to the fiat currencies for its value. What am I missing?
No, you can go from Bitcoin to other currencies and other assets. It's not just tied to the dollar. Now, if the dollar system were to stumble and collapse tomorrow, what would happen to crypto? I think a lot of them would go to zero because they're like remora on the belly of a shark. They're free riders. Offshore, people use Bitcoin for different things. I have friends who live in the Middle East, for example, and they use Bitcoin as money because the countries they live in, like Syria and Lebanon, don't have governments. They don't provide services to their people. So you have to pay for everything, oftentimes in ways that are unconventional. So they'll hand people a number for their Bitcoin. They'll literally write it down on a piece of paper and hand it to them. That is a different use case, and a lot of people around the world use cryptocurrencies for money laundering, for evading U.S. sanctions. The EU just came out with a long report talking about how crypto is still primarily a problem for money laundering. So, to me, I think crypto is just a symptom that says that people realize that the dollar system is in trouble and they want to diversify. They want to get out. That's essentially what it's saying to me. That's not so different from what we went through in this country in the 1900s during free banking, when we had various depository institutions around the country issuing their own pieces of paper that said, I owe you an ounce of gold, right? And you hope that they had the gold in their vault. That's not that different. To me, the troubling thing about crypto is that it's clearly not an asset. There's nothing here. It's just a gaming instrument. And people have, I think, one way or another, created a new game that lets them make money. This is what Americans do. Americans are very good at creating new games. AI is a game. AI is basically you talking to an electronic parrot. But everybody thinks this is great. And look at, we've benefited from it. Buy NVIDIA, buy any of the other stocks that benefit from it, and you get enormous gains. But is there real value here? I don't know.
AI as well as taxes, because I work in AI, but also there's the article, I think it's in The Economist, that AI is a bigger bubble than what we saw previously with tech. But do you own any cryptocurrencies?
No. I'm an investment banker. So unfortunately, if you trade in cryptocurrencies directly, you become a compliance problem. You get a little red flag put on you, and you spend lots of quality time with your compliance officer. Why? Because depending on what kind of crypto you're trading, you could be engaging in money laundering. You could be violating AML regulations. If you want to trade Bitcoin, what I tell people that are onshore in the United States, use the ETF. That at least is sanitized as far as some of the compliance issues. If you're going to trade coins, I think you have to be offshore.
So when we talk about crypto, Congress just passed, I think it's called the Genius Act. Again,
Yes,
my Luddite.
stable coins.
Why are
What
you
is a
laughing?
stable coin?
What is the Genius Act going to do in my world? Let me ask it from that.
Nothing. It's marketing. It's just like AI. What is a stable coin? It's a prepaid gift card under the laws of most states. Now, they want to ensconce these things into banks so that they can evade state law regulation. Is that going to make them more attractive? No. I mean, think about it. Circle went public. Circle will allow you to create your own coin. They're going to take your money, invest it in T-bills, and keep the spread. They're not going to share that with you. And they're going to charge you fees. What a great model. But are we creating any value here? I would say no. This is mental masturbation. This is just, a complete waste of time compared to, say, building a house or creating a new industry that actually provides real services to real people. Nah. I think crypto is just a way of funneling off excess energy that should be used in other places.
Servers. But back to Bitcoin, you just explained to me something that I thought does have value, which is the ability to create a market when there's no government. Isn't that value? Does Bitcoin have value?
If I live in a country that doesn't have a government, yes. If I'm laundering money, yes. There's certainly a use case here. And there's a lot of new coins and new other types of markets, what they call L2, which are essentially catering to the offshore need. The Russians, for example, need to evade U.S. sanctions. So coins are perfect for that. They can go from one lily pad to another, wash the money, and have it come back up to the surface somewhere else, buy physical commodities, buy oil, what have you, right? And you've cleaned the money. So I think the real use case for coins offshore is predominantly money laundering and evading the U.S. sanctions regime, which are very onerous. Let's face it, the U.S. has weaponized the dollar. So if they don't like you, they're going to do everything they can to force you off the grid. You see this with the BRICS countries. They want to come up with a new clearing system so they don't have to deal with the dollar, deal with the United States. But, in the U.S., coins are a plaything. People speculate on them. It's very funny. I get all the little alerts every morning from some of the coins I follow. And what's really cool about them is you can say anything you want at them and you're not violating securities laws. You can make the most outrageous statements, say, oh, it's going to double tomorrow. Nothing. No problem.
P.T. Barnum would, not P.T. Barnum, who was it? P.T. Barnum? We would have a wonderful time in this era.
Yes, well, and Ponzi. Where's Carlo Ponzi when we need him?
So let me take a quick. We're going to talk AI and we're going to talk about taxes. But I need to ask. I want to back up because you worked at the Federal Reserve. I was unaware that you were the first person to actually write about what was then secret, the FOMC notes, the meeting notes.
Yes. Yes.
What drew you into, whether it's the Fed or into finance? What motivated you to choose this life?
Well, when I sat at the kitchen table with my dad years ago on Macomb Street in Washington, he would quiz me about the Basel Accord. My dad was a writer. He was a speechwriter for Richard Nixon. He had a consulting firm in Washington. He knew all the Fed chairmen going back to Arthur Burns. He got Paul Volcker reappointed. So I grew up in a household where politics, the Fed, money were what we talked about over the dinner table. And as I got through college, I was a history major, and then I ended up working at the Fed in New York after I worked for Jack Kemp. I was a management trainee for Paul Volcker, and I worked for Jerry Corrigan. He was president of the New York Fed. So that gave me an insight into banking and finance that most people don't have. I had met most Treasury secretaries, most Fed chairmen as a child. They came to my mother's Christmas parties. My parents were two of the most significant Republican operatives of the 70s and the 80s. It was just a fascinating house. You never knew who would be upstairs having a drink with my dad. He lived on Volta Place in Georgetown, around the corner from the Georgetown Club. And we had all kinds of characters up and down the row of that street. We had, Judge Silberman with half a dozen U.S. Marshals out talking to my dad in the morning when he was walking the dog. So I had a very privileged and a very interesting upbringing. And I think that's how I got into finance. I worked at Bear Stearns before the firm went public. So it was kind of interesting. But I wanted to get out of Washington. That was the interesting thing. That's what brought me back to New York.
So let me ask you about when you were at the Federal Reserve, and this is a really, it's out of left field question, because I used to walk past Maiden Lane all the time. Did you ever see the gold? Because they have gold
Yes.
in the basement there, don't they? What was that
sure.
like?
Well, all of the managers at the Fed would take turns, and the chiefs, who were underneath the managers, opening the gold vault in the morning. They had this whole procedure that they would use to go down there and do that. When I worked at the Fed, we were still doing cash and check. So the Fed was open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And, I remember we could go out at night in New York City and I could pass out on the couch in the trading room in the morning. And Jerry Corrigan would wake me up at 7 a.m. before he went off to Jim Brady's across Maiden Lane to meet with the bank supervision staff at 7 in the morning. McQueenie, McNally, and Minahan. So, the Fed was a very different place than it is today. It was much more like a private bank, much more focused on operations. But I really enjoyed working there. It was a lot of fun.
I had, terrible time trying to teach myself. And then I had some very good mentors who used to be Fed people, how to understand Fed speak. You may not even watch, I call them the pontificators on the different financial news networks. And let's be honest, I used to be one of them. But today, if I do watch, I want to throw something at the TV screen. Do you have that experience, or do you find that the sharing of what's happening is accurate on the part of the financial press?
No, I don't think so. I think over the years, everyone assumed that the Fed was in charge. So the narrative has been boiled down to a policy discussion about whether the Fed is going to change the target for Fed funds. I just did a blog post this week that talks about whether or not the Fed should pay interest on reserves. And most economists don't understand that as the debt has grown, the role of the Fed has changed. The Fed is no longer an independent monetary agency that's concerned with employment and inflation. You never hear that in the media, by the way, Adam. What are they concerned about? They're concerned about keeping the Treasury market open. And that's why they have to be able to pay interest on reserves, because whether you own T-bills or whether you own money market funds or whether you have reserves at the Fed, if you're a bank, right, that's a deposit at the Fed, they have to make sure that the interest rate paid on all of those assets is roughly the same. Because if it's not, then the good ship lollipop is going to tip over. If the banks got paid reserves when they sell securities to the Fed that didn't have a yield, if they didn't pay interest on those reserves, what would the banks do? They would go out and buy T-bills, and they would run the interest rate into the ground. It would be zero or even negative. So the role of the Fed has changed. The role is now the banker to a heavily indebted country that probably is going to have to do a debt restructuring before I head off to heaven. So, but you never hear that in the media. Most people in the media have so little understanding of money and finance that, you just have to grit your teeth and smile and look at them and say, okay,
Yeah. I hear my colleagues, and I was one of them, would talk about the role of the debt and the dual mandate. I'm like, oh, please, enough. Inflation and employment.
Yeah.
But let me ask you this, and I'm going to put a plug in for Julia LaRoche. I know you're on her
Oh,
podcast.
yes, I love Julia.
I worked with Julia at Yahoo Finance. She is a treasure, folks. Watch her when you're not watching us. And you're there regularly on her podcast.
Yes,
but you recently
monthly.
You were talking about this issue with her. And I got lost a bit. So help me understand. You were talking about first the so-called 2% inflation target actually winds up diminishing the value of your money. And I was doing the math, wasn't the greatest math student, But you and she were talking about, 10 years, if it's 2%, you're going to lose 50% of the value. And I was like, no, you'd be down to 82 cents. So help me understand what I got
20 years.
wrong.
I might have misspoken. It's about 20 years.
Oh, okay. I was worried that I had to go back to elementary school to get my math lessons.
No.
But this whole concept of the Fed, you also talked about, because this is a discussion that happens. If people stopped buying U.S. Treasuries, the Fed would step in. The belief is the Fed would step in to buy, but that doesn't necessarily equate a good thing, nor would it happen. Do you recall that
No.
part of the discussion with her?
Oh, yes. There's an assumption. It's the same facile assumption that people bring to the table when they say, oh, well, the Fed will just raise or lower interest rates and everything will be fine. This is about as much as most people in Congress understand about the central bank. When the Fed buys public securities in the market, they have to buy them from a bank, right? What happens? They credit the bank's account at the Fed, and the deposits in the system grow. So the inflation from the Fed monetizing the debt by purchasing treasury bonds and treasury bills and the rest of it flows through the banking system. The banks get bigger, but they don't get more profitable. Their profitability is actually hurt overall. And you saw this during COVID. The banking system expanded by almost 40% between 2020 and 2022, and then it started to shrink gently. But if you really look at the internals of the banks, were they making more money? No. In fact, if you look at interest expense, interest earnings by the banks, and then you look at net interest income, it's been flat going back 4 years. And you think to yourself, well, gee, Chris, they're making a lot more money. But the problem is that the net for the banks actually has been impaired. And so there's no free lunch. What happened when the Fed bought all those securities? Home prices went up. During COVID, remember, Donald Trump in March of 2020 declared an emergency and said, well, you don't have to pay your rent or pay your mortgage. Nobody asked what would happen next. And I work with mortgage lenders, so they were all looking at each other like, how are we going to make the bond payments next month? If we're not getting cash from mom and dad on their mortgage, how are we going to pay the guys who own the Fannies and the Freddies and the Ginnies? The government guarantees those securities, remember. So while the Fed showed up, they bought bonds and the street was awash in cash.
Which drove up the price of homes. But
Very
we
much.
also have the issue. Go ahead.
No, you had people getting 1.5% mortgages, so they went out and bought a house. I have a 3.
Refinanced.
And that's right.
Yeah. Why not? If you're going to give me money, yeah, I'll take it. But November 1st is coming. And you brought this up with Julia, that the expiration of the forbearance on some of these debt situations expires November 1st. What happens economically? Will we notice this? What is the consequence?
I think that you're going to see higher delinquency in the mortgage market. It's not going to be a huge change initially, but I think by next year, some of the internal problems that we do have in the economy, particularly that bottom quartile of consumers who never really recovered from COVID and who are still having trouble in terms of employment and everything else, that's going to start to show. Let me give you a tangible example. Imagine you ran a restaurant during COVID and your costs went up. You got your PPP loans from the government. You kept your people on the payroll, etc. But you emerged from that process in 2022-23, and what you find is you're making less money. Your taxes have gone up. New York City, I'm using an example. What do? A lot of them just go out of business. They paid off the PPP loans. They gave their people a goodbye bonus, and they shut their doors. You see that here in New York City quite a lot. My wife and I go to the ballet. We sponsor a dancer at American Ballet Theater. That's one of our biggest sources of joy. And a number of the restaurants across the street from Lincoln Center have closed. They just can't afford to stay open anymore. They can't charge their customers more money to balance the books. And doing business in New York City is expensive. So the thing again, why should we encourage people to move to New York? We should be encouraging them to leave.
Please, no, I do. I'm right in what used to be the heart of the fashion district. I think they called it. This is where the textiles and the dresses, everything was made. Our office building is there. But when I think of New York, and we talked about this with the person who could become mayor, I used to say definitely going to become mayor, but I don't know. He was elected by a very small in a primary. But either way, talking about a $30 minimum wage, talking about rent freeze, we don't have to hash why those might be mistakes. But I used to volunteer, I haven't done it in a while, at the Bowery Mission. I used to serve breakfasts, and I would see clearly mentally ill people, but I also see people who's like, oh, wow, you could have been, at Fox, or you could have been, I was on Wall Street briefly, you could have been at that firm. That always blew me away. And so when I look at New York City, you talk about sponsoring the ballet. I worry about how do you keep something like New York City going forward when we're about to repeat the mistakes of the 20th century?
Well, that's a very, very profound question. Look at all the institutions that we've built in this city over the past 100 years. Who are going to support these institutions going forward? And I don't mean just people who are going to pay for tickets and go to the shows and this and that, right? I'm talking about the business community who paid for all of this infrastructure that makes the city work, the trains, the subways. When the subways were first introduced in New York City, they were so expensive that they were considered a luxury. Normal people did not ride the subway. They couldn't afford it. This is the issue that Henry Ford faced when he started making his car. He wanted the average American to be able to own a car. And at the time, they were prohibitively expensive because it was just a completely new technology. People were still dealing with the bicycle when Henry Ford came up with the Model T. So inflation has always been a problem. And Mr. Mondami will not be the first socialist mayor of New York City, even if we forget Joe de Blasio, right? You go back 100 years, we had some really nasty socialists in this country. But they were propelled by inflation. The key issue was the cost of living, the cost of housing. People were moving from the countryside into the cities. And guess what? Everything was expensive. So in a way, nothing has changed.
And you talk about the cost of inflation. Listen, I'm at that age where we're talking about the next plan because once we're not working anymore and we're living off of the retirement savings, can we stay in New York if they're going to charge us the income and the city income tax and the state income tax? Or will we do the 6 month and 1 day in a non-tax state like Florida, maintain the apartment here? But that's another discussion. But you described your childhood. Your dad wrote speeches, I think you said, for Richard Nixon. You grew up in a Republican household. And then you have a quote in the book about taxes. I don't think people should make judgments about you. You said, quote, a large portion of the amount of offshore dollar assets represents tax avoidance by U.S. individuals and corporations accumulated since World War II. While the national debt measured in tens of trillions of dollars may seem a substantial sum, the total of offshore assets created by American individuals and companies to avoid taxes is arguably higher. Are you saying we need to raise taxes?
No, but I think tax enforcement could be much more astute. The Republicans always attack the IRS and, they want to disable the ability of the government to collect taxes. But it's really offshore shenanigans by corporations and wealthy individuals to conceal income. That's the biggest problem. If we could collect even a portion of that, it would be enormously helpful to balancing the books. But again, when the dollar is the world's currency and when a large part of the dollar market exists offshore, there's always a tendency and indeed an attraction to hide the money. And so what people would do is they would set up subsidiaries in different countries and they would play games with expenses and transfers of assets and what have you. There was a very famous case we refer to in the book involving Dow Chemical that also involved Donald Trump. It's a fascinating story, but it's complicated. All of the good stuff is hid behind complexity, Adam. You know that. You worked in journalism.
I'm glad you brought that up because you see behind me the North American portion of the company I'm at is AI. And one of the things I try to get across in my role with my team is if it's complex, forget it. It needs to be simple. If you can't understand it, if you can't utilize it quickly, it will turn people off. You just brought up complexity, but complexity can hide a bag of sins.
Well, that's cryptocurrencies. We have no idea how they trade. We can't see the market. There is no tape that we can look at after the market closes. You just have to depend on what people say to one another in the laundry room, I guess.
Well, I remember when I was at Yahoo, everyone was going crazy over NFTs, and forgive the language I'm about to use, but there was an individual who actually sold his expelled gas, his farts, as NFTs, and people bought this. I won't say the word, even though I could. People bought this, and I was like, are you crazy? You said with Julia, do not expect interest rates to come down. And I realize that the press is focused on the fight between Trump and Powell. That seems to me to be a circus show. What I focus on, and I think you were focusing on with Julia, was that mortgage rates around 6 or 7%. That's what our parents would have dreamed of and was the norm. And if we're back at that norm, is that necessarily a bad thing?
No, it's not. But the change from the lows of COVID to where we are today was so relatively large that it has done enormous damage to the mortgage market, to housing markets. It caused a lot of misallocation. Look at all the construction that went on outside of markets like New York. Where did the developers in New York go once they were declared the enemy by the progressive politicians? They went to South Carolina and Texas, and they built too much. And Florida. But we have enormous amounts of both rental and purchase property that are basically going to have to be discounted to sell because they're just way too much.
When I think, look, we don't intend to leave New York just yet. And I do care about the future of the city. I loved hearing that you support the things that you're passionate about. I think it's an obligation if you have, I believe, to share with the things that are important to you. New York is important to me. And you talked about we're going to have to literally bulldoze obsolete buildings and get them out of the way. My fear is my fear is that Mandami is his name. If he becomes the mayor, somehow they enact these rent freezes. I don't know if that really can happen, but if they do, you have more buildings falling into squalor. You create a worse housing situation, and you don't get what you were talking about, which is the construction of relevant housing.
That's right. Think of it this way, Adam. How big does a building have to be in Manhattan to break even? How many square feet do you need? At what price for that building to be able to pay the property taxes, the operating expenses? Operating expenses for your typical apartment in New York City is almost $5,000 a month. And people find that astounding. They say, how can that be, Chris? That's what it costs to run a building. I don't care if it's a big building or a little building. So the smaller, older ones that are no longer viable, they need to go, clearly. But do we have another Robert Moses who's going to short-circuit the political process and use a lot of very interesting techniques to get stuff done? No. We're in the opposite end of the process. So what happens with the Mandami? We continue to demonize landlords. They leave. They will abandon older, smaller buildings, and the city will end up owning them. Well,
that's the problem. The city will own them, but the city, as you pointed out at the beginning of this discussion, already owns, or the state owns hundreds of thousands of apartments, which are falling into squalor. I mean, the New York City Housing Authority is a $30 billion travesty.
It is, but they're a slumlord. When you think that the average rental is only about $1,500 a month, and it costs the city $3,000 just to keep those damn units open in their horrible condition. The city doesn't have the money to take care of them. You
said you worked for Jack Kemp, the congressman from upstate. Yeah. Did he not have a policy? We were kids at the time, or younger. I thought he had a policy, instead of maintaining New York City Housing Authority, turn the apartments over to people in the form of ownership. Let them own them and then get out of the way. Was that his suggestion? I can't recall if Jack actually was trying to do conversions that way. It may seem like it makes sense, but if the people don't have the income to own the unit and contribute to taking care of the collective assets, the building, right? It's not going to work. You know, when we demonized landlords during COVID, you didn't hear anybody in Congress talking about the fact that all of these landlords basically had to
lever themselves up, borrow money to stay in business. What happens to them now? The reason that you're seeing all the pain today, not in the consumer side of the economy, but in the commercial side, commercial real estate, multifamily real estate, particularly in blue states, is horrendous. The banks won't even finance it now. So if we have Mr. Mandami, these assets will become orphans and they will be abandoned, and the city will end up having to take ownership of them involuntarily.
That's worked out so well in the past. I have a buddy who owns 2 properties. He's a landlord, but
That's right.
he pointed out to me that this year he's no longer allowed to do a background check on a potential renter. So he can't find out if they've ever been convicted of a crime or if they've ever been bankrupt
That's right.
or evicted. So he said, why on earth would I take the risk of renting to anyone? But it was 2019. They put the caps in. If he wants to renovate a property, and again, he only owns two, not buildings, 2 houses. If he wants to renovate them, he can't get the cost of the renovation back in the form of a tax break. So he's like, why would I even do that?
No, they won't. And in larger buildings, I know this for a fact, what happens if they have a tenant who's been there for 20 or 30 years, the tenant will leave, they'll gut the apartment, and then they'll lock it. Because if they can't bring that apartment up to code, they can't rent it again. It's not just city regulations. Their insurance company will not allow them to rent the apartment if it's not up to code. So if you're a business and you take possession of a retail, storefront on the street, right? You as a tenant are responsible to bring the property up to code. That's very expensive. And you're not even the owner. And the city of New York will sit there and beat the shit out of you over code violations and everything else. Why bother? So what's going to happen in New York City is you're going to have very wealthy people living in condos surrounded by desperately poor people who are barely able to make ends meet. And the politics are going to reflect that.
And I'll get off New York, but one of his things is to house homeless people in the subway. And I'm like, he's an idiot because we're already doing that. I have a homeless man who lives in my subway station below our building. I see him every morning. I enable him because I give him food if we have leftovers from a restaurant. It goes to him. I get it.
What else are you going to do?
Thank you. What else are you going to do? Well, and when I encourage everyone to either volunteer in the school system, I used to tutor kids, or at Bowery Mission, you get a sense of what our fellow citizens are dealing with. And I don't have the answers. I do think, by the way, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
His policy about maybe free buses, I think that's crazy unless you can come up with a legitimate way to pay for it. Because if people were to move outside the city into more affordable places, and this is something Elizabeth Warren, believe it or not, used to talk about years ago with school choice. If people could get to their jobs but live in more affordable places, you would solve a problem. The question becomes, how do you replace the almost $7 billion in fares that the buses and subways raise?
Yeah, but that's only a tiny bit of the problem. The overall fully burdened cost of running the MTA and the subways, we don't even begin to pay for it with fares. The capital expense for the new cars, repairs, all of that stuff is not covered by fares. This is the issue of inflation. When you have cost increases that are beyond your control, the local politicians can't do anything. They just make it worse. So when he comes up and say, oh, well, we're going to freeze rent, that doesn't help. Free buses, okay. Maybe we should just recognize that transportation in major urban areas is a public good. But the cost of that is going to be quite high, and over time, they'll have to reduce service. That's what will happen.
Elizabeth Warren used to be in favor of a voucher system. You can see it in her book, The Two-Income Trap, written before she was on the national stage. Give people vouchers.
The daughter's book, by the way. The daughter did most of the work.
But you know the book. And what I took from the book was, okay, we artificially increased the price of housing because people were in I got to get my kid into the good school system. So they went to those neighborhoods that had allegedly had school systems. If you gave everyone a voucher, let the money follow the student, then you don't have to leave your neighborhood. You just have to get your kid to school. Would that be a viable solution? Because I look at the education system, 37% of New York City public school students are literate, and we spend more per student than any other system in the country.
No, I don't think so. Unfortunately, I think New York's going to have to crash and burn. The progressive assumptions that underlie it going back a century have, been proven to be false. And again, if you're going to allow inflation to slowly eat away at everybody's spending power, then nothing you do on the margins is going to fix it. The best thing for low-income families who are trapped in New York right now is to leave. Go live in a different community. I live in Austin, up in what we call Sleepy Hollow. And Austin is a remarkable community. It used to be all Italian. Now it's largely Hispanic. And the community is great. They have rebuilt the schools. It is a vibrant, interesting place. And a lot of people commute into the city in the morning. But the cost of living there is a third of what the cost is in Manhattan.
Your time is valuable, and I need to start winding down, but I have to ask you this. Again, it was with Julia LaRoche. Julia, forgive me for stealing your topics.
We could always talk about Julia. She likes it.
Yeah, it was something that made my ears perk up. I worked at Yahoo. Yahoo's owned by Apollo Global Management. They are private equity. I think they're in the process of trying to just, get rid of Yahoo, as private equity does. But you said on that podcast, why on earth would any rational person invest in private equity? And it was a discussion about the elevated interest rates right now. Tell me more about that, because, I know what Apollo's done to some of my friends at Yahoo, and they're all running for the exits.
Well, private equity, if you go back to the original years when people like Yale University and others started getting in, it was a tiny, tiny marketplace. They found interesting opportunities and they made outsized gains. But then you had a huge crowd of institutions, countries, everybody else pile into private equity looking for those outsourced gains. And you know what? They would have been better off buying the S&P 500 futures. That's the bottom line. So the public markets have benefits that we have forgotten over time. And meanwhile, private equity is a train wreck. You have such problems there. You have people selling portfolio companies and stakes in companies that can't go public. They're just not attractive at a loss. I think the worm has turned in private equity very much in Apollo. When I look at them and some of the other players who've been stuffing risk into insurance companies, have been going out and buying pensions and annuities and stuffing them into private equity, I think people like Apollo are going to have a lot of reputational risk to deal with in the future, because the politicians will come after them.
Oh, yes, they will. The politicians or the mob. I mean, we agree to live by the rules. Yeah. As I listen to this discussion as Gen X, as I'm approaching that transition from the work world at some point into I think I would still do something, but what I'm getting at here is I'm listening to us talk, and I'm now more nervous about the future than I was when we started talking. And I try to live in the moment, but I'm sitting here thinking,
everybody
wow,
lives in the moment.
Pardon?
Everybody tries to live in the moment. We're not able to do that anymore. For a long time, Americans could just say, well, somebody else is looking after this for us. But now I think Americans are going to have to become much more engaged in politics. We're going to have to talk about spending. We're going to talk about money. Americans used to talk about money all the time 100 years ago. The currency was one of the chief political issues. Nobody talks about it now. We just assume it's on autopilot.
Am I wrong? I tend to believe, and my other half, says I have overwhelming capacity for joy. Perhaps I am the foolish optimist, but I believe if as a country, as a united country, and people say we're not, but that as Americans, we would shoulder the burden, if everyone shouldered the burden, to right the ship. Do you agree or do you disagree? Because I don't see a leader who could lead us to that.
Well, we don't have a leader who is talking about everyone right now. Our leaders are talking about the two extremes in the political spectrum, and the middle is essentially disenfranchised. The reason for that is complicated, but that's how you get traction politically, is by being extreme. So can we get a politics that focuses on the middle, on, as John Kennedy said, what are you going to do for your country? Yes, I think you can, but that'll require a crisis. We're going to have to bottom this thing out pretty hard before we can wake everybody up. And those who have not been as successful as others are going to be really angry because they're going to say to the leaders of our society, why did you let this happen? But the reality is, does anybody want to see their taxes go up to pay for more Medicaid? No. That's the bottom line.
As you were saying that, I was thinking about even Robespierre wound up getting executed because I'm thinking about the
That's
mob.
right. You got it. Look, I'm going to go to Uruguay. My wife grew up in Uruguay. She has a wonderful family down there. I'll get a big hat and light-colored clothes, and I'll sell coffee on the beach in the morning before it gets too hot.
So let me wrap up. Are you optimistic about the future?
Yes, we can fix problems, but we have to wait until things get so bad that we can smack everybody across the face and say, hey, listen to me. That's what happened in March of 1933 when Henry Stiegel and Carter Glass walked onto the floor of the House in the Senate and said, here, vote on this. There was no debate over the Banking Act of 1933. They just passed it because they didn't know what else to do.
I have to ask you, you brought up Jay Gould and Jim Fisk in the discussion with Julia, and it was funny because I was having that discussion with a friend just the other day about, how people used to manipulate markets. Have we moved from that era? Or are we essentially, the Jay Goulds and the Jim Fisk are now our institutions?
No, we still have a similar game. The game used to be with Fisk and Gould, they were arbitraging paper and gold because gold was money, paper was debt. And they said, wow, look, they move a lot. This is pretty cool. Today, we're arbitraging paper with crypto. So we have a piece of paper that kind of says you're owed something with something that says you got nothing. You got a token. To me, things like cryptocurrencies just show how far we have gotten away from value. And eventually we're going to come back.
And last question. Does Donald Trump fire Jay Powell, or do you not even give a darn about it?
I hope not. President Trump has mishandled the relationship with Jay Powell rather grotesquely, turning loose Bill Pulte. My God, as the attack dog makes no sense at all. He should have had lunch with Jay Powell, said, I'm not going to reappoint you. Off he goes, right? And then figured out who he is going to appoint. Powell would probably have stepped down by the end of this year. But I think now they pissed the man off so much, and they've also concerned the staff at the Fed so much about what Trump would do if he was in charge of the agency. I think Powell's going to stay on as governor. He's going to replay Mariner Eccles and Harry Truman. People forget that. Harry Truman thought he could control the Fed when he appointed William McChesney Martin. Martin had been in the administration. He was head of the Export-Import Bank, right? But Martin betrayed Truman. Because as soon as you are confirmed as a governor of the central bank, nothing else matters. And you will defend the temple. So whether it's Mickey Bowman or Chris Waller, either one of them, if they were appointed chairman, will do the right thing. Because ultimately presidents come and go. Fed governors are there for a lot longer.
I didn't get to AI. We'll do that hopefully if I get to have another discussion with you. Next time. Last thought. You get the last word. Anything you want to leave our viewers with?
I'm always optimistic. A lot of my readers and friends say, Chris, what would you do if you were Treasury Secretary? The bottom line is we have lots of assets in this country. $40 trillion in debt is a trivial number. So the question is, are we serious enough to get our house in order so we can run the country in a reasonable way and maybe tone down the politics, the politics of envy, I like to call it. You could call it the politics of inflation. The last thought I'll leave you with is I got to meet Freeman Dyson years ago. I was dating a young lady who lived down in Princeton, and so we joined the Princeton Astronomy Club. And one of the interesting things that he said in his writings in the New York Review of Books is that we're really good at replication, but we haven't figured out metabolism yet. So think about that. Americans are really good at growth. We're really good at building things, but we haven't figured out a way to run a society in a way that's relatively stable, that doesn't have periodic crises. And I think that's something we should think about.